Welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, policy, and politics that move Texas. I'm your host, Derek Cohen, the Chief Research Officer here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And not joining me today again is Brian Phillips, who is getting his last days of brat summer out before we move on into the legislative session. However, who I am joined by is Senator Phil King. We're going to get to him in just 1 minute. My obligation, both contractually and spiritually, is, of course, to point y'all towards www.texaspolicy.com, where you can find podcasts such as this one, our research, any sort of multimedia to fit your needs around the Texas legislature and the things that we discuss. So, as I teased earlier, we are here with Senator Phil King from SD10. Senator, thank you for joining me.
Oh, I'm excited. Glad to be here.
And so, Senator, one of the things, and I think that's very important to discuss because I know this animates a lot of your positions and knowledge base in some of your focus areas in the legislature, is your past public service. So you were, for a long time, a police officer in Fort Worth. You were a justice of the peace, a member of the judiciary. What kind of moved you from, that's obviously a career in public service and different facets of public service, over to the legislature? Did you just say, I don't want to get paid for this anymore?
No, none of it was planned. I actually was, as you mentioned, I was a police officer in Fort Worth for about 15 years. And then I decided to quit and go to law school. I ran for justice of the peace in Weatherford in Parker County, just west of Fort Worth, which back then was a part-time job, and it paid as a part-time job, but it kept food on the table. We had 5 children at the time. We had 6 by the time I finished law school. In fact, I thought about this earlier. For 4 years, I had a 104-mile round trip to Dallas 4 nights a week, which it's hard to believe you go through that, but you just do it, and everything's fine. So I finished up law school, was still justice of the peace, and David Barton, who was then vice chair of the Republican Party of Texas, showed up in my office. He lived in Parker County in Aledo, and said, hey, we're trying to find somebody to run to replace Rick Williamson, who had retired. Would I be interested? I said, absolutely not. I said, but out of courtesy, I said, I'll ask people I trust, and I'll pray about it. And I did, and to my surprise, got a lot of encouragement to do it. Most surprisingly from my family, because I had been gone 4 nights a week for 4 years. But 3 days later, I'm running for the legislature. That was 1998. Yeah.
Wow, and it's hard to think that was the birth of Representative King, and now we're here. Now you're here representing SD10 in the Senate as well. So I definitely like to start off with a little bit of a light item at the top, though. Depending on particular perspectives, this could be a light item or not a light item. But this is of North Texas interest, so I want to go to the expert on this. So there's been a lot of talk about this being the Cowboys' year for about the last 20 years. However, I think that this year they actually have some good components in place. Do you think that we're actually going to see a deep playoff run? And I'm about to say you will be held to this, sir.
Look, I can make speculation with some accuracy about legislation. I'm not even going to try with the Cowboys. But I'm excited about the season. I usually don't get terribly involved till things get to the playoffs. And then I start paying a lot of attention. But we went over for the they kind of had their opening public practice the other night, and we were over there watching it. It was kind of fun. Took some grandkids, had a great time.
And correct me, the AT&T Stadium is in your district, correct?
I'm about a half a mile away from it, so I claim it. But and I still try to use it to get in on occasion, but it hasn't worked yet. But yes, I'm close.
Well, okay, I won't tell Jerry otherwise. So
the district basically runs from roughly the Cowboy Stadium to west of Brownwood.
That really spans. I mean, if you look at it like the composition of that is a district that is all at the same time an urban district, a suburban district, and a rural district.
Yeah, it goes everything from very dense Arlington and Fort Worth to Shackelford County with 4,000 people.
Oh my goodness! I was about to say those numbers were definitely starting to get out into West Texas. So one of the animating issues that we definitely wanted to bring you in for, because you've done so much good work on this and so much work that has yet to be done. I think is the grid, and I know you've filed several bills, many of which we're going to discuss here, but. Just starting in from an assessment, what would you say that your overall current assessment of the grid is, and how did we kind of arrive at this point?
So you really have to go back to 1999 to understand where we are today. And I hate to take us back that far, but you've got to understand the history. So in 1999, we created a competitive electricity market in Texas. We took the old franchised utilities that had their own footprint. They owned the generation. They owned the retail customers. They owned the lines and poles in that area. That was Texas Electric. That was Houston Power and Light, companies like that. They were a monopoly. And we deregulated them and structurally separated them into three companies. The generation company, which was all free market. Anybody could come and build a power plant in Texas if they wanted to. The lines and poles, which were still regulated, but they're like your highway system. Anybody can put power onto the grid, sell it off the other end. They just pay a toll fee en route, a tariff fee for delivering it. And that's a regulated side. And then there's the retail side. It was very elegant, had tremendous success, was the model for the country until the federal government stepped in not too many years later with these large subsidies for then wind, and now with the Inflation Reduction Act for solar. And, you always get more of what you subsidize and less of what you tax. And so all of a sudden, all the money that was going into building coal plants and even some efforts toward nuclear back then and toward gas-fired plants all shifted over to building wind, and now wind and solar, and really almost entirely solar at this point because of the new subsidies. And that really skewed what was set up as a free competitive market that was very successful. Where that has left us today is in a very vulnerable situation. Our lines and poles are in really pretty good shape. We can build and do build transmission lines faster than anywhere in the country. We do it pretty well. There's some improvement could be made. On the retail side, although it's beginning to look a lot like an oligopoly, there's still a lot of retail electric providers. Some years down the line, we may have to look at that again to make sure it's got all the competitive, that it's not just an AT&T and Verizon, that you've actually got a lot of electric providers, not just a couple of big companies. But we're okay right now. Where we are at serious risk is in the generation side, because for these last couple decades, very few new gas-fired power plants, something that you can turn on with a switch that's always available. We've got tons of natural gas in Texas. It's so cheap and reliable for us. But very little money had been going into what we call dispatchable electricity, something that's ready to be dispatched at any time. And all the money was going to wind and now solar and some to battery. And that has made us vulnerable, not because there's not a place for wind and solar, but the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine when you need it. And that really was demonstrated to us in Uri when we had 246 people die due to things freezing up and wind and solar not performing as had been promised.
So I think you hit on something, and I'd like you to explain that to the viewers and the listeners, is about the market distortion that comes with some of these renewable subsidies. Can you explain to us in practice how that works?
Yeah, and let me correct something. You and I keep using the term renewable. It's really not renewable. The sun and wind are renewable. They're there every day. But what it takes to convert sunshine and wind into electricity is not renewable, and it's not inexpensive. In fact, it's less renewable and more expensive than natural gas. So, for example, the rare earth materials and all the products that have to go into building these giant turbines, which we still don't know what to do with except pile them up in wind turbine junkyards, because they don't last that long. They last maybe 15 years, and then they have to be taken down. We don't know what to do with them. A gas-fired plant's going to be there for 25 or 50 years. The same thing with the solar panels. They don't last that long. We don't know what to do with them, and the materials that go into creating those are very expensive and very difficult and costly to mine, and frankly, pretty much all of it comes out of China anyway. So it's really not renewable in the sense that it's always going to be there. The sun and wind are, but making those into electricity is not renewable. I can make an argument that natural gas is much more renewable because once it's burned off, it is pretty well gone with very, very few trace elements. And there's an abundant supply of it for hundreds of years into the future in Texas. So it is not renewable. It is also not less expensive because for every megawatt of, we'll call it intermittent solar or wind that you have to create, for every megawatt of solar or wind intermittent generation you have to create a megawatt of backup dispatchable, which for us is natural gas because you can't build coal or nuclear anymore. And so you're actually paying for that megawatt twice, and the only one you can really depend on all the time is the natural gas. You can't depend on the wind and the solar.
So specifically on the intermittents, they are quite heavily subsidized through the production tax credit, I believe, on the federal mechanism. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, or fill in the gaps where I'm leave stuff out. Is that essentially that because of that production subsidy, that when these units of power are produced, units of electricity are produced via wind, via solar, they actually tend to, a big chunk of the overhead to produce it gets taken out by the subsidy, and they can then enter the market at a incredibly skewed or depressed rate.
So think of it this way: you're a large investment fund, or you're a large banking institution, or you're someone that wants to get in and build a power plant. You're a BlackRock or whoever. So if you look and go, I can build a natural gas power plant and I can produce electricity, and we're going to have to go buy natural gas to use it, and we're going to have to fight all the anti-fossil fuel people and all of that. Or I can let's take a pretty day in the spring or the fall. On a nice pretty day, a megawatt of electricity on the wholesale market in Texas may go for, say, $30. Well, I'm going to get a $25, $26, $27 federal tax credit subsidy if I'm doing wind or solar. So if I'm looking at that from a pure making money standpoint, are you going to build a gas plant that you got to buy the fuel for, and then you got to sell the electricity, or are you going to take the wind or solar subsidy and know that on most nice days, on an average weather day, you can almost give your electricity away and still make a lot more money than the gas plant makes. You're going to do the wind or solar, and that's what everybody's been doing. And it has skewed the market. So the free market that we put in place, the competitive market for electricity in Texas, is gone because of the federal subsidies have completely skewed that whole marketplace.
It's just another case where federal, air quotes, free money tends to wreak a lot more havoc than problems that it seeks to alleviate. So we covered the run up to where we are now, where we're at now. This begs the question: is where we go from here? What does it look? What does the grid and the state of Texas's both power supply and consumption look like years into the future?
I tell you, it's a little frightening. So when we left the legislature last year, in December, we were told by ERCOT, that's the organization that manages the grid, and the Public Utility Commission, that our peak demand, the most we would need in power on any day, was 35 gigawatts of electricity. I'm sorry, 85 gigawatts of electricity. That was our peak demand. We were told that by 2030, which is now basically 5 years away, we needed to be at 110 gigawatts. Well, that was very disturbing because not only did we have to come up with that 25 more gigawatts in power, but it was going to need to be dispatchable so it could be something we could depend on as always being there. Wouldn't have another Uri. Wouldn't have when electricity really gets scarce, even if there's enough of it that day, it makes it much, much more expensive, just anything supply and demand. So how do we even get to 110? That was disturbing. We came back this year. We had a hearing in the Senate a couple of months ago, and we were told, hey, it's not 110 gigawatts you got to get to by 2030. Now it's 150 gigawatts.
Oh, my goodness.
Almost doubling our demand. So how do you get there? So that's the challenge right now. All the money still wants to go toward wind and solar, which is very inefficient, not reliable. There's a place for it, don't get me wrong, but it's not what you want to rely on every day. So the demands are very heavy going forward. I tell you what's fascinating is 40% of that new estimated growth from 110 gigawatts to 150 gigawatts, 40% of that is Bitcoin mining and AI and data centers. They use that much electricity. Another 20% of it is the electrification of the Permian Basin oil and gas development. In 2 years, the Permian Basin will be using as much electricity for oil and gas development as the Houston area uses. Is that amazing?
That is an incredible factoid. But to your point, I think that you said it's a bit frightening, and I would sign my name to that as well. So what would the solution be, such as it is? I mean, a lot of people, and one of the things that I think is a bit of a people say the all of the above approach, because I think they again don't necessarily assign a lot of realistic thinking to the problem that you just raised about the intermittent generation. But I think you have other folks that are like, oh, all we need to do is plop down a couple nuclear reactors and problem solved. And I think that's short-sighted as well.
Well, it is. I mean, first, nobody would power their house just on wind and solar. Why? Because they know there's going to be a lot of days they don't have any electricity at all. So your choices after that, if you want to have electricity, you can use the wind and solar. Batteries are an option, and batteries have a growing market, but they don't last but a couple of hours. And they may produce a lot for 2 hours, but then they're gone, and you got 12 to 24 hours to recharge them, or some significant period of time.
Which is power then diverted from natural consumption.
That's exactly right. So the other options are coal. It's virtually impossible to build a coal-fired plant now. They're being closed out. They're aging out. That's a lot of federal environmental issues. Nuclear, there's only been one nuclear power permit issued since the 1980s, which that one was actually in Texas, the Comanche Peak. Since then, there's been one more. 2 years ago, it was either Georgia, North Carolina, I forget which, but it was the Southeast. It is so difficult to get a nuclear permit that nobody's really thinking in those terms. There are a lot of discussions of these small modular nuclear units, which are going to be available for prime time in the future, but we're not going to see that for 10 or 15 years. It's just not going to happen at best. So really what you've got is you need to build gas-fired power plants in Texas. We've got a lot of natural gas. We can build peaker plants that are there for the peaking hours. We can build combined cycle plants that are there for longer periods of time. That's really the solution for Texas.
Well, thank you for that, sir, because I think that is going to be, when y'all come back in, just a few months now.
Yeah.
When y'all come back in a few months, I think that's going to be a very pressing issue. I think after Uri, a lot of people take a look at some of the solutions, and there were some Uri-specific solutions, definitely, that y'all addressed. But I think that they don't understand that both what happened that led to Uri, and both kind of everything from the load combination to kind of I would say the developmental trajectory of Texas Power is not something that you can slap a patch on during one legislative session or two legislative or three. This is going to be something that needs long-term developmental planning, and I appreciate you delving into that. Another issue that we'd have that I think we need to deal with, just because of our geographic location, is essentially the border. Things that we've seen in our polling, things that is echoed very cogently in national polling. So somebody from Laredo and somebody from Toledo, Ohio are equally as likely to identify as such, is that the border and border security and immigration as a broader issue are really, really contentious issues that we're facing right now. So let me kind of ask a similar question as I did to the grid. Basically, when it comes to border security, what is your assessment of the current situation and current efforts? And then I'm going to segue into that, then what do we do?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. I just took the second group of legislators from around the country down to the border, Senate presidents, majority leaders, speakers, just trying to help them understand that they're a border state also. That's not just a cliche, but the fentanyl deaths and the crime, the Venezuelan gangs, all the things that are going on in their state are really start at that border and helping them to understand that. And actually, it's fascinating when you take them down there. We've taken 2 groups down there from around the country, and it's amazing how quickly they zero in on understanding the problem, because when you see it, it is so prominent. And what I would tell you is that however bad you think the border is, from watching Fox News or Newsmax or whatever you watch, however bad you think it is, it's worse. Now, Texas has made tremendous efforts that I know we'll talk about in just a minute. But when you just think in terms of the number of people that are coming across, the fact that just in the last few years, Texas by ourselves have seized over 500 million lethal doses of fentanyl.
Shocking.
And we're just getting a fraction of what comes across. And of course, everybody knows it's the leading cause of death for 18 to 35 now, I think. And when you look at the amount of people that are funneled into sex trafficking and children into human trafficking and all the evil things. But I'll tell you one other thing that goes on. I was a cop in 1980 when we had the Cuban boat lift. And I think about 250,000 people came over from Cuba. Castro snuck into that an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 hardcore criminals. We knew who they were because they had tattoos on their wrist or on their forehand there, so you could identify a different tattoo for each crime, which actually is not a bad idea for us to do here, frankly. But anyway, we knew who they were. So I'm a Fort Worth young police officer. And even though there were only 5,000 to 10,000, we were seeing those people and dealing with them on a regular basis. It took the law enforcement in the United States years just to work through those 5,000 to 10,000 Cuban criminals that had come across. We have allowed, not we, the Biden administration and the Obama administration before him have allowed hundreds of thousands of hardcore criminals, murderers, sex offenders, drug dealers, gang members. The Venezuelan gang members are very prominent right now in the news. We've allowed hundreds of thousands to come across, and our law enforcement community is going to be dealing with those. Our grandchildren in law enforcement are going to be dealing with those. And sadly, those folks are going to be creating heinous crimes for decades to come. It's going to be a tremendous, tremendous problem.
Well, you mentioned the Venezuelan gangs, and obviously the easy parallel is with some of the immigration in the early 20th century, late 19th century, that you essentially see an organized crime criminal element coming over here. And that while that was not the intended consequence of any immigration policy at the time, because such as there was in those era, that you essentially see that was one of the outcropping. Now we're in a state today where we're actually this would be the equivalent of saying, okay, Don Corleone, get on the plane, we're going over to the United States. And I think that that's one of the areas that people don't understand, specifically on the Venezuelan side. You're basically seeing organized criminal rackets now starting up, and I think Colorado is getting the most popularity at the time. But this is going on all over the place. So I guess the natural question that this leads me to is, what
do you do?
Yeah, what do you? And then because Governor Abbott, to his credit, is throwing every kitchen sink and some other people's kitchen sink at the problem.
Well, let me interrupt you there first. Yeah, I think I really would like your listeners to know what all Texas has done.
Please, by all means.
Because we're almost at this point that we almost don't know what else to do. So we've deployed we'll spend this fiscal year over $3 billion with a B dollars on border security. We have the same amount budgeted for the next fiscal year. On any given day, we have thousands of personnel assigned to the border. That's the Texas Army National Guard, Air National Guard, Texas State Guard, DPS troopers, Texas Rangers, Parks and Wildlife. Basically, anybody we've got that's got a uniform and can carry a gun, we have down there. We have opened our own prison facility just to help process the people that we arrest. Because if we arrest anybody, which we arrest a lot, we try to hang on to them if we can find them with drugs, human trafficking. If we can find a reason to keep them, we do. If we don't, of course, we have to release them, turn them to the feds, and they send them off by planes, trains, and automobiles everywhere.
Absolutely.
So we have over 5,000 monitoring cameras installed. We have our own gunboats. We have our own shallow draft boats. We have our own aircraft, fixed wing and rotor wing rotary aircraft that have high levels of technology. We, on any given day, may pick up ourselves 1,000 people crossing, but Texas alone just cannot do this. It's a 254-mile border, which is essentially the same as from Georgia to Maine. Think about that. And there is no government in northern Mexico. It's the cartels. I've got a missionary friend who had to come back finally because of the danger for his family, but they were in northern Mexico, and he said, Phil, even when there's a traffic wreck, the police don't show up at the traffic wreck anymore. The cartel members show up. They clear the intersection. They haul off the drunk driver. They do all those things. They are the government in northern Mexico. And so Texas is we've even passed a law that says it's illegal to be here illegally. Now, that's under a federal injunction, so we can't enforce it right now, but we want that case to work with rapidity to the U.S. Supreme Court, where we hope that the Trump court will strike down, at least in part, some of the U.S. v. Arizona from, what was that, 2014 or 2015, that said states had no role in immigration, no role in protecting their borders. And we're hoping that case will be the catalyst to change that law. Do you know up until the 1860s or 70s, there was no federal immigration law. States handled it all. It wasn't until then that they began to intervene into that space. So we have an historic role in that. The Supreme Court is blocking us from it. And, of course, the Biden administration sues us every step of the way on the buoys, on the fencing, whatever it may be. But we are almost at the point of what else can we do, and Texas can't do it alone.
You know, it's funny because you mentioned the Biden administration, and I think that I like to, I'm pretty curmudgeonly myself, so I like to lament about kids these days. But if I ever had a young employee who avoided work the way Alejandro Mayorkas does, I mean, that almost needs to be law. It almost needs to have like some sort of an award for it. But yes, so that's a very good point. So hopefully there will be some reform there at the federal level for that. But there's one thing I of your record I didn't want to escape without discussing, because I think these are both very, very important things that have kind of changed some of the environment of the state for the better. Was you were really one of the key figures back in 2019 that kind of led, I would call it, the anti-BDS push, and then again in 2021 under SB 13 was the anti-ESG push. And I think that there's a lot of overlap in those two areas. So how do you kind of get involved in preempting some of that, I would say, bad think?
All right, so there's three sisters. Two of them deal with the human side. One of them is on the corporate side. And those three sisters are CRT, DEI, and ESG. Now, they're all Marxist in nature. CRT, critical race theory, and DEI, what they do is divide people into groups and judge and assess people by the group that they're in. You're either white or you're black. You're rich or you're poor. You're Christian or you're Jew or you're Muslim. You are LGBTQ or you're straight. And it's the exact opposite of what Dr. King spoke of, where he said he dreamed of a day when people would be judged by what? By their character, the content of their character, rather than the color of their skin. Our Constitution is set up to protect and judge people based on their individual characteristics, on who they are as an individual, and the rights, the God-given rights that they have because they are an individual. CRT and DEI lump people into groups, and if you're a group, then you're assessed. You're either an oppressor, you're a victim, based on the group you're in, not on who you are as an individual. Everything about that is Marxist in nature. It leads to nothing but rampant discrimination. It's the reason you have things happening on the Columbia campus and campuses across our country this past couple of years, and which is simply that particular group is Jews, and it's all about Jew hatred and hatred of the nation of Israel because of the Jews' affiliation, obviously, with the nation of Israel. So that's the two sisters on the human side. The corporate side, the corporate sister, is ESG, environmental, social, governance. And that is where corporations begin to take on and deal with things in groups as well. If you're fossil fuels, then you're bad, and we're going to try to put you out of business, try to boycott your industry, try to prevent the people that we loan money to or we control their boards or have involvement in one way or another buying their products. We're going to try to put those out of business because they're in that fossil fuel group or in that Second Amendment group. They're a gun manufacturer or sales or something like that. And so the ESG is the corporate side of that. We passed a law, actually it was Senator Brian Birdwell's bill in 2019, I guess. I was in the House, he passed it, and it basically said that, look, the oil and gas industry is an essential part of the Texas economy. I think back then it was like 35% of our economy, millions of jobs associated with it, either directly or indirectly. We rely on that, obviously, for energy. It leads to energy independence nationally.
Say nothing of the discussion we just had.
Yeah, all the different things we've talked about, certainly on electricity generation as well. And yet we had large organizations like BlackRock and others that were saying, hey, we're not going to lend you money. We had independent oil and gas brokers that would go to a bank they've done business at for 20 years to fund their next deal. These are the small companies to fund their next deal. And they say, hey, I'm sorry, we're actually underwritten by Deutsche or whoever, and by Wells Fargo or whoever, and they're prohibiting us from doing loans to companies that are in the fossil fuel industry. We saw that in a number of varying forms. And so SB 13 that Senator Birdwell at the time passed, Brian, it simply said that, look, the state of Texas, on any given day, we invest hundreds of billions of dollars in pension funds, rainy day fund savings accounts, whatever it may be, that Texas is just simply not going to do business. We're not going to allow those monies to be invested in any company, in any fund, in any organization that boycotts the oil and gas industry. Passed out of the Senate. I picked it up in the House. It passed out strongly in the House. And it's really fascinating. Within just a few months, we had all these large organizations, BlackRock being one, walking the halls of the Capitol, going to the comptroller, going to the Railroad Commission, saying, how do we get out of this box? Because we still want to do business in Texas. And the answer was quit boycotting the oil and gas industry. But ESG, CRT, DEI, those are all sisters. They're all Marxist in nature, and they want to try to control us by putting us in certain groups or by controlling the marketplace by identifying groups that they believe are not attractive to their agenda.
Well, let me say something, because I thought that you, in your example, actually, you kind of underlined a very interesting point. So you mentioned Deutsche Bank, just for example, which I think that specifically within the ESG context, extrapolated back in our conversation to the power generation. If you look at what kind of, the Eurofication of finance has led to, you have countries like Germany that are actually deindustrializing. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think anybody would bat an eye if we were finding new and more efficient ways of going about powering our industrial components. Now, as you mentioned, the intermittent energy sources are not necessarily green nor free or cheap, as you illustrated. But here you actually have proof positive in a major first world country that they are moving backwards, and that is because it's kind of adherence to this particular mindset. So that we covered three major components that obviously will be before the legislature again here in a couple months. We covered things kind of where they were. Let me ask you this now. What haven't we covered? What are some sleeper issues that you think might pop up during this legislative session that people maybe aren't discussing at the moment?
Well, a couple things. I'll just mention one. I'll take some liberty here and just mention one of my bills that we passed out of the Senate last time. When I say my bills, nothing is an individual member's bill. Everything is a team effort that we do, everything successfully anyway. But one of the bills that passed out of the Senate with strong Republican support last time, was a bill requiring the Ten Commandments to be placed in every classroom in the state of Texas. And you say, well, why do we want to do that? Well, obviously, we want kids every day to read. Don't kill, don't steal, honor your father and mother. Those are things we want. But the other side of that is that there's no document in American history that has had a larger impact on the structure of our Constitution, our ethics, our morals, our values, our legal system than the Ten Commandments. Mm-hmm. If you read the Founding Fathers' writings, they quoted the Bible more times than any other book by far. Something like 4,000 is the last count in one study I saw. The early McGuffey readers, the kids had to memorize the Ten Commandments early in school. So it's been part of our history, part of our culture, part of our legal community, our ethics, our values, everything. It's really interesting. In I guess it was in the 60s, there was a religious liberties case where the Supreme Court created something called the Lemon Test. And the Lemon Test, for decades since, has been used as the test to whether or not a particular statute, a particular law, or a particular action of government violated the alleged separation of church and state that was a religious liberties violation under the First Amendment. And it was very harsh in its structure. Up until 1980, you had seen that was in the 60s. Up until 1980, you had seen the Ten Commandments hanging on walls in public buildings and classrooms all across our country. That was challenged in 1980 in a case called U.S. versus Kentucky, where they came in and said, hey, you can't hang the Ten Commandments in classrooms. And I think it actually applied to all public buildings in that case. Using the Lemon Test, the Supreme Court said, yes, you can't have the Ten Commandments in classrooms. And after that, the Ten Commandments were taken down in every school in America. So now the Lemon Test has been struck in the case Bremerton ISD, the Coach Kennedy case, which I guess was the year before last now. Mm-hmm. When that case was passed by the new Supreme Court, was written by the new Supreme Court, when that case was presented and won, they struck the Lemon Test. And so theoretically, all these cases, and there's a sundry of them, that had been ruled on based on the Lemon Test, they should be no longer good law, but yet they still are because there's still case law supporting them out of the Supreme Court or whatever court. And so our hope in bringing this Ten Commandments legislation was we know there will be an injunction against it by the left the day that it passes. But we hope it will be the case that proceeds with rapidity to the Supreme Court, and we hope the Supreme Court will say, hey, the Lemon Test no longer applies. This is a substantial part of American history. You cannot understand American history without actually understanding the Judeo-Christian ethic, the Bible's role in that, our Christian history of the colonization and everything of America. And we'll then we'll say the Lemon Test is gone, and you now can put Ten Commandments back up in the classrooms. There's this ghost of lemon that's floating out there and supporting a lot of really bad religious liberty decisions over the last now 60 years. And we hope that this will be one of the ones that gets rid of some of that old law.
Well, I mean, you didn't look any further than some of the discussion that's going on right now on some of the high quality materials that TA is developing for the school, and the fact that it refers to Bible as literature and should I say documents from other faiths as well. That usually to teach enduring moral truth and things like that, things that even from a secular perspective have value for students to learn, especially when strung together over the course of one's life cycle within elementary, middle school, and high school education. And I think that so much is getting made out of that because there is, to your point, this almost a misunderstanding of the Jeffersonian ideal of separation between church and state, which is more informed by the Church of England than I think as it was a thing that had to do adopting state religions and whatnot, as opposed to a what the Freedom from Religion Foundation would say is a right to basically not be confronted with any of this in any public space whatsoever, which, to your point, I think is a charitably put, a misreading of the. Well, sir, we covered a lot, and we're coming to the end. But one of the things that that Brian likes to cover, because I mean we are a show that covers not only the policy but politics of Texas, and I have been reliably informed that you are a politician, huge if true. But one of the things that I found interesting, and one of the segments that we have is called Survey Says, and so we look at a lot of the polling data that we both do here, and is conducted by other people as well. And I came across, and far be it from me to quote CNN, but I did come across a CNN poll that I found rather interesting, and mostly because in Pennsylvania, we are, the polls technically open in Pennsylvania in less than 2 weeks, in 12 days from now. And we see these polls that are split. We see, at least as of right now, Georgia, Nevada, and Pennsylvania basically within the margin of error, and this has been replicated several polls running. Harris ahead in Michigan and Wisconsin, Trump ahead in Arizona. Basically, these are the states that are in play, that whoever is going to win the presidential race has to assemble a coalition here. So as a person who's ran many political campaigns and successfully participated in political campaigns yourself, how do you see this race developing? I'm not asking you to predict the October surprise or any of that stuff, but how do you kind of see this particular, which is a pretty unique election that we're facing currently, kind of set across the history of elections that you've experienced?
Wow, that's a really broad question. So,
answer it however you'd like.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I don't think there's anybody that's actually asked the question. You will find very, very, very few people that say, hey, I'm a lot better off today than I was when Trump was president. I know a lot of people get, they used to be concerned.
Unless you're a green energy lobbyist.
That's true. But I know a lot of people used to get concerned over tweets and what people say and all of this. And the sad thing is that so many people vote for who they like. It's hard to vote for somebody that you don't like. Mm-hmm. And Kamala's done a really good job of in the last few weeks of coming across likable and entertaining, and she can give a pretty good speech as long as she's got a teleprompter there, and she smiles and comes across as nice. President Trump is a different personality. He is a businessman. He is rough and he is tough, and he is not always the most friendly person, but he is without question incredibly effective. I tell you what, I just finished reading a book about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and when I was going through the part where Kennedy was addressing the nation and explaining what had just happened, they just come public with it. And I remember sitting there thinking what it would have been like. We are so close to some type of worldwide conflict. What's going on in Ukraine, the threats in Taiwan, obviously what's going on in the Middle East, Iran, North Korea. And it will be so easy for us to fall into a worldwide major conflict, which obviously can have incredible implications for nuclear and biological and chemical weaponry and everything else when you're dealing with the type of people that we would be dealing with. And I remember reading through that book, and particularly listening to Kennedy as he gave that presentation in that book to the American people. And I remember thinking, what would it be like for Joe Biden to be sitting in that desk, or for Kamala? You needed someone that was tough, that was smart, that was able to deal with Khrushchev and also able to deal with all the people in his own government structure to get to where we got to, and were able to resolve that conflict without nuclear war at that time. I cannot envision Kamala Harris dealing with Xi or with Putin or with Iran. I cannot picture her walking into one of those difficult situations where nuclear warfare is a possibility, and having the courage and the strength and the competence and the intellect and everything else to be able to address that. Donald Trump, regardless of what anybody thinks of him, is exceptionally prepared in experience, personality, and strength to deal with those situations. So that's one of the reasons that I strongly support him. As far as how the race is going to go, most Americans aren't looking that far ahead. They aren't that concerned about. They aren't keeping up with what's going on internationally. They're the economics. When they sit back and think about it, I'm not doing as well. But then you have Kamala Harris promising a lot of things, and frankly, so many of our voters, particularly our young voters, are getting all their news over what just happens to flop across their phone during the daytime. So I'm very, very concerned. I'll say this. Trump historically polls about 5 points lower than what the actual vote would be. So if you're seeing it shows he's 7 points down, he's probably 2. I'd rather it show he's, 2 points up and he's really 7 points up. But we are where we are. I'm exceptionally concerned. I think if he can continue to push the issues and frankly stay more away from the personality issues, I think if he will push and push and push the laundry list of good, solid issues that he has, that Kamala is very weak on, that Joe Biden was very weak on, and problems that they cause, I think he has the potential for having a very, very strong victory. But we are not there yet, and the fact that early voting starts very soon gives me a lot of concern.
Well, to your point, Sarah, and this would be at least one whole extra podcast, is I think that under the Biden administration, and where you essentially see Vice President Harris positioning herself, is this this kind of failed idea of they'll call it something like something to avoid escalation, but it turns out to be almost like Chamberlain appeasement.
It's worse than that.
Yeah, because it's like it's like, if we just give the Sudetenland, there'll never be a second ask, and it's like we have copious amounts of history that.
Look in the last week, 6 civilians, 1 American citizen are executed mafia style by Hamas. And who does the Biden administration, who does Kamala Harris blame for it? They blame Netanyahu. They blame Israel for the evil that Hamas just struck.
Yeah.
Are they going to blame us when China blockades Taiwan? Are they going to blame us when Iran further attacks Israel or has terrorist acts against us? Is it always going to be our fault? I think that's what their default is that it's all about America's failings, instead of it's all about these evil nations and this evil triad of North Korea and Iran and Russia and China. It's not a triad, it's more than that, but that have come together. And I think they will always blame America, and they will not stand up to these evil empires and entities.
Well, I was going to say, from your lips to God's ears, I think that this is what you get when you tend to dispense with a belief in an enduring moral truth, as we talked about earlier. So that brings us to our parting segment, one that can be serious, can be lighthearted, whichever you prefer. Simply just want to ask, what are you watching? Are you watching anything specifically on TV, a specific race for the within the election coming up, or are you watching your particular flower bed bloom, whatever the case might be? What are you watching, Senator?
Well, I'll tell you, we talked about the electric grid, and I can tell you I've turned into something of a prepper. I wrote my kids a letter the other day that said, I promise I'm not a prepper, but here's some of the things you need to do. I've gotten to where everywhere I go speak, I talk to the audience about, look, I'm not a prepper, but, we talk about the electric grid. We talk about the possibility of terrorist acts. I mean, you've had 60,000 plus Chinese and Russian military-age men that have come here. You don't have to be much of an intelligence expert to suspect what they are here for at the right time. And we talk about terrorist acts that can be the attacks on our infrastructure. You and I tonight, with a deer rifle, can go out and shut down all the electricity for Metro Austin just by going and firing into substations. I mean, it is exceptionally vulnerable. Same with water and other things. So, so I talk, whenever I talk to groups, I say, hey, I'm not a prepper, but look, whether it's a big tornado coming through your community, whether it's a terrorist act that shuts down our supply chains, whether it's electricity failure, whether it's a big storm that comes through, you need to think in terms of, what do I have to do to take care of my family? And that's simple things. Having 10 or 12 cases of bottled water. If you've got a propane grill, having 3 or 4 extra tanks just in case you got to cook off of it for a couple of weeks. Having a month worth of a food supply for your family. If you've got medicines you have to take, trying to buy those in advance. I mean, kids used to die because they didn't have baby Tylenol and cough syrup. Have those things available for your kids. Make sure that your family knows where to meet if your house is destroyed by a tornado or whatever, that they know where to go to. Make sure your kids have the Find Me on all their phones. I mean, just thinking ahead of these pragmatic things. It's funny. And always throw into that, it never hurts to have a few thousand rounds and the right weapons. But it's amazing. Everywhere you go, young, old, elderly, everybody agrees that these are risks we're at. I'm actually having solar installed on my house right now. I already have a generator, not because the dollars work, but because I'm concerned about the grid being vulnerable. We got 18 grandkids. I know if all the power goes out for 2 weeks, or for a month, they're all showing up at my house. That's just the way it'll be. And so we make sure we're doing that. So that's not a lighthearted thing, but I think those are things that people need to give some common sense and think about. We saw what happened with Uri. People need to be preparing their families to get by a month or so without all the essentials, because if it doesn't happen, that's great. If it does, you're going to be really, really thankful.
Well, I don't think there's anything too morose in being properly prepared for something that is, I wouldn't, maybe not the probable outcome, but definitely a possibility.
Well, it may just be the tornado that comes through your neighborhood.
Absolutely.
And you're without power for 2 weeks. You may just be Hurricane Beryl and be without it for 10 days. You're awful glad to have those things.
Absolutely. Now, I would say my selection, I was going to pick the Texas-Michigan game, but now in light of that...
No, I'm not going to sports on anything. I always am wrong and deal prepared.
We'll see if my co-host Brian was here, he'd definitely come to the backing of the Longhorns. I'm actually, I attended the University of Michigan, so one of the... We have a difference on that, but I think we can both agree that it's probably going to be the Longhorns' day on Saturday. On as much as that pains me to admit. So that brings us to the end of the show. Really appreciate you coming on with us here at The Right Idea. Remember to go to texaspolicy.com for these podcasts, for other multimedia research, everything else that we produce. And remember, in the words of Sam Houston, do right and risk the consequences.